All right. Well, good morning or good afternoon. Today we are going to do our fourth in a series of volunteer coordinator webinar trainings. And today's topic will be on volunteer supervision, orientation, and training. My name is Heather Burke. I'm the National Partnership and Volunteer Program Manager. And before we go into the slides, just the housekeeping, the usual. If you can put yourself on mute while we're going through this, that'd be great. But if you do have questions along the way, feel free to jump in, take yourself off mute, or type in the chat. I will try and monitor those as we go. And if I'm if I'm not great at keeping up with the chat, then I'll definitely make sure to answer questions at the end. So with that, we're going to start off with supervising volunteers and things that you need to think about if you're a volunteer coordinator, or even if you're not the official coordinator at your project, but you are overseeing volunteers. You need to understand the role that you play, and volunteers need to understand their role as well. And it is an all-encompassing activity. It's overseeing others does take some special skills, and ultimately your supervisory skills aren't measured by what you accomplish but by what your volunteers accomplish and what their experience is like while they're working for the Corps. And it's really important to be a good supervisor with volunteers because they can walk away at any time. They are just there out of the goodness of their heart. We're not paying them to be there. And so it may take a little bit of extra finesse as you're overseeing volunteers to make sure that they're having a good quality experience. So some of the tasks that you need to think about as you're supervising volunteers is the orientation, preparing to bring them on board. Once they're on board, that ongoing support, you need to be checking in with them regularly, making sure they have the skills and understanding to be able to carry out the tasks. You need to report and track the hours and the type of work that's being done by those volunteers. And then it's also important at the end and along the way to provide evaluations so that those volunteers know that they're doing a good job, or maybe they need to focus a little more on a particular area. Giving them feedback along the way is really vital. So the first part is prepping for those volunteers. We covered on a previous webinar the position description, and that helps when you're recruiting volunteers, but then once they're on, that they have a clear understanding of what their roles are. Introducing them to other volunteers and the staff. You want to make your volunteers feel like they are part of the team, regardless of whether they're being paid or not. Preparing their work area, if you are providing them with a desk space or storage locker or anything that makes them feel like you've taken the time to be ready for them to get there. And then explaining how the supervision will take place, who the volunteer will be answering to, who they're going to get their duties and their tasks from. Explain how they're evaluated throughout their time. Risk management. It's good to also talk policies and procedures so they understand what we operate within as the Corps of Engineers, and then what the limitations are as far as what they can and can't do as volunteers and what the staff will be doing. So that ongoing support and resources is training. It's not just the initial training, it's training throughout the time that the volunteers are providing their services. That coaching on the job is really important. Showing informal appreciation. I mean, it's great to do recognition lunches or some kind of big event, maybe at the end of a season, but it's also really important to appreciate your volunteers throughout the time that they're serving. And that can be very informal. And then providing the materials and the information that they need to support their work. So some of the supervisory tasks that you will be in charge of are reporting. So the individual and overall volunteer hours, the impacts of that volunteer work, how many miles of trails did they clear, or pounds of trash they picked up, things like that. We don't necessarily track all of that in SWIBI and our Civil Works business intelligence reporting system, but we do for special events like National Public Lands Day. We track a lot of those details. But even though we may not be reporting all of that in our centralized database, just for your own awareness and the value that you're getting out of the program, it's not a bad idea to be tracking some of those major accomplishments that are done by your volunteers. And whether you're just the supervisor or the actual official volunteer coordinator at your lake, you need to be reporting between those folks, and then provide periodic volunteer reviews. That can be verbal or written, but again, it's good to just document throughout time what those volunteers are doing and how they're performing. So evaluations, depending on the time frame, if you've got long-term volunteers, maybe you do an official evaluation once a year, or when they're finished their period of performance. And then as far as supervision methods, you can set up specific appointments at designated times. You can just have open time, sort of an open door policy. Maybe you do monthly group or individual meetings. That walking around supervision, that's just, checking in with the volunteers every once in a while. We have quite a few volunteers that work independently. They know their tasks, they understand the safety measures they need to take, and we send them out for the day, and we may not see them all day long, but maybe if a ranger's out on patrol, they can check in and just see how they're doing. And that's kind of that walking around supervision that's mentioned here. Regular reports and phone calls to and from volunteers if they're working off-site. We may have some volunteers that don't actually physically work at our project location. Maybe you've got someone that's doing interpretive design and development for you, or research, something that doesn't require them to actually be on site, but they're still providing a service to the Corps. There's those off-site check-ins, and then just checking in by email or social media, chat, Teams, whatever the volunteer has. It's just important to be touching base. So orientation. If you've ever volunteered, whether it's for the Corps or some other organization, it's important to kind of put yourself in the shoes of a volunteer and think about, how did that organization make you feel when you started there? Did they make you feel at home? Did they help you understand what you needed to do, who you needed to talk to? And if it was a good orientation, then you want to mimic that in your own work environment. If it wasn't, think about, okay, what would you have done differently? So how were you trained to be competent in carrying out that task? And then do that for your own volunteers. So some important parts of a volunteer orientation is, one is the welcome from the coordinator, but also from other staff. If you have the OPM or someone else, lead ranger, that can come around and introduce themselves and welcome that volunteer, providing the Corps history, mission, values, just a general understanding of what takes place at your project. What are the important missions there? If you've got an organizational chart that you can provide to them so they understand how everyone is connected and works and what their duties are, that can help them know who to go to if they have a question. If you have a volunteer handbook, that's really great to provide to your volunteers, that walk through a lot of the pertinent information that they need to know about the project and about their position as a volunteer. Covering things like clothing standards, whether you provide them some of our volunteer clothing, or if you're not, just, this is what we expect. You're representing the Corps of Engineers when you are in your volunteer position. So covering code of ethics, really important to be providing emergency contacts in case anything happens while they're out working, that they know, besides 911, obviously, but who they need to call on the project staff to help them with whatever the situation is. And then project and park brochures, maps, info sheets, that helps get the volunteer oriented to the location. If you can take them out, kind of give them a tour of the project so they get the lay of the land, that can be helpful in addition to those handouts that you provide them. And then, of course, vital is safety training, not just once, but ongoing safety training. Whether you do that just for your volunteers or you have them sit in on your staff safety trainings, it's important that they're hearing the same things that our core employees are hearing. So a checklist, this is just an example we have on the gateway, but these are some topics that you might want to include. Who should be involved in the orientation, how you're going to do it, figuring out the best time. Maybe you have a bunch of volunteers coming in at once and you can do a combined orientation. But sometimes you may have volunteers that are coming in at different times a year and you just need to do one-on-one. And then, ask which volunteers need an orientation. I mean, pretty much everyone needs some type of orientation, but depending on the length and the difficulty of their service, that can be pretty brief. Like, for instance, if you have volunteers that are just coming on for one day, you don't necessarily need to give them the whole history of the Corps and your project and the lay of the land. They really just need to know what they're doing that day and the safety items and the procedures that they need to follow. We do have a number of examples of orientation on the gateway that have been provided by projects, and these may be in volunteer handbooks or actual orientation presentation slides. So I recommend taking a look at those and using whatever looks good to you to create your own orientations for your volunteers. And this was something that was provided from Carter's Lake in the Mobile district. And they found this really helpful to set up for their volunteers so they understand who they need to go to. And so the volunteer names would be put in at anywhere that you see volunteer, and the rangers and et cetera. So actual names would be in this chart. But the thing that this helped out with was they were having an issue for a while where all their volunteers were just going to the volunteer coordinator whenever they had an issue or a problem. And of course, that person couldn't work every day. The people have leave and people have sick leave and trainings and TDY. And so it helped the volunteers understand that org chart of who they could go to next if the person they would normally speak to wasn't available. So this is an example that you could take and modify for your location and provide to your volunteers as part of that orientation and understanding of how your project works. So for volunteer training, potential training topics, skills, attitudes, knowledge, perform the job. What kind of decision making will the volunteers have? And this is important, I think, especially when we have volunteers that may have been around a while and they start to take a lot of ownership and pride, which is great, but sometimes they can also take on more roles than they should. And so you just need to outline where that line is drawn with your volunteers. Sometimes it's just important for them to report to you as a ranger what's going on, not step in and try and solve a problem. Maybe there's something related to Title 36, that sort of thing. So that what they can and cannot do and why you need to outline to them in that training. How to handle emergencies. Unfortunately, things happen in our parks and our volunteers may be the first one there on the scene. And so helping them understand and, providing them training if you want to on things like CPR or first aid, or who to reach out to get help with that sort of thing. Basic water safety concepts. We do have a guide that the water safety team put together and a set of training slides that is required. You need to go through that with your volunteers. And we had a question come up the other day. My volunteers never around the water. Do I need to provide this training? Yes, because we have volunteers that we never think are going to be around the water, and we had a drowning happen with one of those. And so we just want to make sure that they understand the basic rules of water safety. who the volunteer works with, how their responsibilities fit with the staff and their roles. You need to go through that with them. And then explaining how their position fits into the larger mission. It can help your volunteers feel like they're serving a larger purpose. Okay, yeah, so maybe they're going out and clearing a trail, and that seems like a menial task, but how does that actually help the overall recreation program, the local economy with the people that come out to the park and enjoy those nice clear trails that are safe to use, etc. So giving them the big picture can also be a good part of training. Keep your volunteers updated, keep records of completed training, develop a checklist to monitor that required training. If there's something that would be helpful to have handouts for, especially with more of our older generation of volunteers who aren't maybe as digitally savvy or digitally comfortable as some of the younger generations coming in, written or printed handouts can be helpful. If you have larger groups, you might need to divide them up based on what their training needs are, and pull in other volunteers to help, especially volunteers that you've had come back year after year. They like to take on sometimes a larger leadership role, and they can help you in that training and help you in that supervision and orienting of other volunteers. And it's really good if a volunteer has been on the job a while, ask them if there was anything they experienced that they felt like they weren't prepared for. And if that's the case, then work that into future training. Learn from your volunteers of what you could do better to make the experience improved for them and volunteers coming on after them. So it's the responsibility of the volunteer coordinator ultimately, but really any of our staff, to make sure that our volunteers are proficient in operation of any equipment that they use. And I mean, that can be as simple as hand tools, shovels, rakes, but they can also operate vehicles, vessels, motorized equipment. And we just need to make sure that they meet the same licensing requirements and training requirements as if they were a core staff member. So an individual training plan is recommended if you have long-term volunteers, so that you can check off when they've completed that for your records. Some potential training for long-term volunteers, a fee collection, processing fees, handling money, defensive driving, first aid CPR, water safety rules, boat operator training, and then certification for any power tools. And then for short-term volunteers, maybe that one-day volunteer that comes out for a National Public Lands Day or a lakeshore cleanup, just the description of the project, goals for the day, proper use of tools, safety equipment, and then emergency evacuation plan if there were anything to come up that they need to know how to respond to that. As I mentioned, this is the water safety training was developed, I think 2 years ago now, by the National Water Safety Team. So you don't have to do the thinking. You can just go through these slides with your volunteers. It covers all the major topics, hypothermia, reach, throw, row, the different types of PFDs, throwable devices. All of that is on these slides. So you don't have to create it, but you do need to go through it with your volunteers. So motivating your volunteers, you've oriented them, you've trained them, they're working for you, but you got to keep them motivated. It's not just all about, let's put all this energy up front into our volunteers and then forget about them. So you need to get to know your volunteers on a one-on-one basis. Everyone is different. Everyone has different motivations for why they're there or what they like to do. So it's your goal to help those volunteers have ownership of what they're doing, have responsibility for their outcomes, that authority to think up to a certain point. Obviously, as we talked about, there's some lines that we need to set for our volunteers to work within. And then a defined way to determine success, those expectations you have for those volunteers and what you're hoping to have them accomplish. It's important to create that sense of community. And if you get good volunteers, ask them about future plans. Maybe they were only planning to work for you for a couple of months this year, but you'd love to have them back in the future. Let them know that so that they can plan for it. And it makes them feel wanted and needed and special. And, that's just human nature to want that positive feedback. And yes, we have serious work to get done. We have things we need to accomplish, but we also want to have fun with our volunteers, make it a good experience for them. Spending time with them can mean more than any sort of award you can give. And especially those that are motivated to be there by that camaraderie and that sense of community and wanting to feel like they belong to something. Um, and if you don't know why your volunteers there, ask them what they like or what they want, what they're hoping to get out of that volunteer experience. If you hear from them what they're looking for, you can help match our needs with theirs, and that can help with those motivations. So some of the things of why people come out, they want challenges, they want to learn new skills. Some are there because they need credit for school. There may be an impact or a cause they care about. They want to make a difference. They want to give back, socialize, meet new people, have fun. Some have really strong skills. They want to donate. There's tasks that are just physical tasks, and then there's tasks that can take a lot of brain power and a lot of experience and education to perform. And we have a use for all that on the ground. So just tapping in and making that connection is important. And then those three primary motivators that all those things above sort of fall into is that motivation to achieve, that motivation to be affiliated with a group, and that motivation for power or influence. They feel like they're, helping out, but also maybe leading in a program. So find out that motivation and shape those duties to meet those. This is a little success story that we also got from Carter's Lake, and I like to share it because it's a pretty simple thing, but anybody can do this. And what they found was really helpful with their volunteer program was to create a volunteer hub. And it's a list of tasks that need to be done, the hours that they figure it would take to do the job. And instead of the core volunteer coordinator telling people, here's what you need to do, they put those options out there for the volunteers, and those volunteers select the job they want. They sign up on the board. Each job has a list of the equipment, where to find it. And what they've found is they have a lot more productive and happier volunteers, less supervision needed because those volunteers felt empowered and they were doing what they wanted to do. So that's just something really easy, a lesson learned, a success story that can be replicated at other core lakes. And sometimes volunteers can take a negative turn, unfortunately, but we are working with people, and we have 45,000 volunteers in the Corps. So there are bound to be some that are just not right for the position, for the location. And so you need to recognize if your volunteer is the wrong person, and don't avoid having those difficult discussions. You need to sit down with them one-on-one privately and talk through what some of the issues might be. See if there's a way to remedy those. Maybe you move them onto a different task, or maybe they'd be suited better at another lake project. I mean, not to hand off your problem child to another lake, but it may just be that your place is not a good fit, or your group of volunteers and staff are not a good fit. So it's important to know when to cut someone loose and thank them for their time and their service, but it's just not working out. So why would you want to do this? Why do you want to deal with this? Well, if you don't, it's going to impact your staff and other volunteers. If you let things slide, it shows there's no accountability. If you don't address it, it shows that you don't hold your volunteers in high regard, and you want to show them that you do. You don't want to reinforce poor behavior, and if you have a negative experience, your staff may resist using volunteers in the future, and other volunteers may not want to be there as well, and they may leave. So you need to address performance issues as they come up. And some of those things may be the volunteer's not able to do the work, or they're undependable, maybe their behavior's offensive, they misrepresent the Corps, they're not, easy to work with other volunteers, they don't follow our policies and procedures. Maybe over time they lose interest or dedication. I mean, there's a wide range of performance issues. It really just varies on the volunteer. But that goes back to making sure you're checking in regularly and having conversations with your volunteers and your staff so that you can address these things early on instead of, letting them fester and become a big problem in the long run. So as far as how do you confront a volunteer that may be causing problems, one is don't attack their personality. It's focused more on the performance of what's not getting done or what's happening. Be specific if you have specific examples of their behavior that you can share with them. Keep the conversation private. You don't want to call someone out in front of others. Make sure you do this timely, but make sure that when you approach them that you are calm and rational. You don't want to elevate the situation. If you've taken verbal defense classes, that whole I, not you language, this is how I am perceiving this. And then getting agreement on the problem, hearing from the volunteer. They may not be aware that there's any issues or that what they're doing is a problem. Or maybe they are aware and they have a reason. So you want to hear from their perspective and then see if you can find a common solution to the problem between you and that volunteer. Agree on a plan and then arrange for follow-up. See if that issue is resolved or if you need to come up with an alternate solution. Sometimes that's reassigning, sometimes that's training or coaching, retraining the volunteer, providing a different climate if they've lost interest in the work. Maybe when they first started out doing something, they were really gung-ho and excited about it, and then over time just not caring anymore. But maybe there's something else they could work on that would give them that renewed vigor to perform highly. And then you can also show them places that they may apply for in other locations or with another organization if it's just not working out. And sometimes the volunteer is the one that decides to leave. It's not always initiated by the Corps. They may decide this just isn't working for them, and vice versa. If a volunteer chooses to leave the Corps, you definitely want to sit down and try and bring closure to the relationship, understand the problem that they experience, thank them for their service, pinpoint any problems if it was from your staff or other volunteers so that you can address this, and also try and prevent or mitigate any bad feelings as that volunteer leaves, because while they can be our greatest cheerleaders, they can also say, oh, how horrible it is to work with this Corps staff and these other volunteers, and that word can get out as well and harm your program in the long run. If we initiate the dismissal, it's not quite as, I guess, laid out as it would be for a Corps employee, but you can follow similar procedures. You could write an official warning letter, provide assistance to help them change that behavior, and document those changes, give probation, dismissal if those goals aren't achieved, provide notification to staff and other volunteers. We've had places where volunteers were let go, but then the other volunteers or staff weren't informed and that person kept showing up. And we want to make sure that everybody's on the same page and understands that that volunteer is no longer serving for us. So just be communicating with your staff and your other volunteers if you have a case where you have to dismiss someone for poor behavior or not working out. So I'm going to switch gears. This is kind of a two-part training today, just because of both topics are relatively short. So going from supervision, orientation, and training, switching over to incidental expenses and reimbursements. What can we pay for our volunteers as they work for us? So they can be reimbursed for actual out-of-pocket expenses if it has been identified on their 301A and approved in advance. This should be on a case-by-case basis. It's not mandatory. It's not a salary, but it's a way that we can help our volunteers cover costs so that they're not paying out of pocket. So that can be things like fingerprinting fees, if they need to launder their volunteer uniforms and we don't have laundry facilities on site, transportation, lodging costs, subsistence meals, and personal safety equipment. And those reimbursements need to be submitted on the OF 1164, and payment can be made by Visa check or direct deposit from the Finance Center. And I think some districts have gone away from even the Visa check and just gone to direct deposit. So you just need to check with your resource management office to see what procedure they're using in your district. But this is what that OF form looks like, and the volunteer needs to be added into CFMs by a financial officer to process those reimbursements. And then this is a direct deposit sign-up form. So if they want to get their money that way, or if that's what we require in a district, they'll need to fill out that form. Transportation, we can reimburse for transportation expenses for reasonable commuting distance, and that's not defined. Really, reasonable commute kind of depends on where you live. And then local mileage driven can be reimbursed. Reimbursement can't exceed what's in the JTRs, the Joint Travel Regulations. So when those numbers are updated any given year for what we can get reimbursed, it's the same for our volunteers. Sometimes you may want to reimburse for long distance travel if you can show that there's a value. You may be in a place where it's hard to get volunteers, but you are able to advertise widely and get someone from far away. You can reimburse for that travel to get to your site. Invitational travel orders are approved at the district. Those are used for long distance travel. Again, that can't exceed the joint travel regulation values for that year. So this is an example of a request for invitational travel order. Different districts have their own forms for this, but this is just one example. A cost benefit evaluation letter. This was done, I believe it was for Dworshak. I don't know if it says in there, but I know it's Walla Walla. But to get someone out to their project, they looked at the costs and benefits of reimbursing for that long distance and felt that it was valuable to get someone on, considering the value of the service that they would be providing to the Corps. Lodging, we can provide modest lodging at the project site or nearby and not charge the volunteer for that. We can even use the funds to rent or purchase or construct volunteer accommodations. It really just depends on what you have in your project budget. Most of the time, what we are going to be providing are campsites, full hookups oftentimes, or partial electric. Maybe they have a central dump station for sewage. But there are places where we may have old government housing, although we're getting away from using that at this point. But you do have options that are authorized in our policies and our regulations. For food and beverages, the key point is it's when subsistence is incidental to rendering the services. Basically, that means we can't purchase a meal for like a recognition ceremony at the end of the day or something like that, but we can reimburse for meals during their work period. And that has to be approved by your resource management office. So you need to work that through your district and your district volunteer coordinator. But generally, it'd be like if you sent a group off to work all day and they're out on the trail, or they're nowhere near a store or grocery store or a restaurant or somewhere they can pick up food, we might send them out with a sack lunch and some water. And that can be approved by your RM office to allow that. For volunteers that are working long-term, we can also reimburse for like breakfast or lunches. They need to submit their expense receipts to their volunteer supervisor, and that gets forwarded to the coordinator to verify that they're authorized, and that's submitted on that OF 1164 and to resource management. I don't know that too many places are actually paying for volunteers' food on a regular basis, but it is authorized as long as you coordinate and you have the funds to do it. So volunteer clothing, you can purchase items from our core uniform contract, and hopefully that will be opening up here near the end of the month or March. You can order multiple quantities for an individual. They're not authorized to use any of our NRM uniform, our park ranger uniforms. But I'll show you on the next slide what's in our contract. What we don't currently have are t-shirts. Eventually we may get those added, but if you would like to provide t-shirts, you can get those produced at a local vendor. They just need to be in similar colors to what we offer in that uniform contract. So white, tan, or red, unless they are safety shirts for high visibility. So this is what's in our clothing contract. Generally, some years we have items that aren't available because of supply chain issues, but this is what we shoot for on a regular basis. And you are required to use the contract. You can't get any of these things done locally unless we provide some exception where the contract's been shut down too long and there's circumstances, but we can go through that cross that bridge when it happens, but we set the contract up just so that we have that uniformity across the nation and don't have variants coming up through local vendors. So that is all I have for the reimbursement and incidental expenses. As I said, that's a pretty short section there. But we do have one more webinar in this series that will be on the 12th, and that is going into volunteer evaluations and awards. This is also a two-part one, and the second part will be entering your data in SWIBI, which is what replaced NRM assessment, which is what replaced OMVIL. And then also just put on your calendars National Volunteer Week in April, and I'll be sending out reminders about this to make sure you are recognizing your volunteers, which you should be doing all the time, but that's one week that's dedicated to that. So I've recorded this webinar. It will be posted on the Gateway, on the partnerships and volunteer training pages. But with that, I will open it up for questions. If you have any that you'd like to come off mute to ask, let me look in the chat and see. Are volunteer payments issued from the project office or the district office? Well, the direct deposit would just go directly into their bank account. The Visa checks, that's a good question. I'm not sure if those are done by the project or district. If anyone online has experience with that, if you could chat or come off mute and say how your district handles that.
Heather, this is Alan. I can offer a little bit from what we do, and at least at Raystown. If it's a volunteer, you're talking about a Visa check. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So a lot of times the Visa checks are handled at the project office, same location that the GPC holder is located, but in some cases they're not. They're sent to the district office or to other locations. So it's handled the same way that a credit card purchase is. Typically, the GPC holder can just write out that GPC check to reimburse those services.
Okay, thanks, Alan. It looks like Tyler said that it's a Omaha District Project Offices issue payment for volunteers. So sound like that may be fairly standard. Shaylin asked, how often can we order new volunteer clothes? You can, as long as the ordering system is open, which is always the limiting factor, because we are under the same contract that the park ranger uniforms are. And so our volunteer clothing is only available at the same time that that system is open for ordering. But you can order as often as you want, but you're paying for those out of project funds. Those are not centrally funded like the park ranger uniforms are. So really your two limitations are, when is the open period that the website's available, and how much money do you have to spend on your volunteers? But otherwise, I mean, you could go there every day and order one item every day if you want, if you wanted to. At our project, we don't have a lot of volunteers, and many are for just one summer. We use the vests and collect them at the end of the season. Yeah, and that's a great practice to do. Thanks, Michelle. Reusing your volunteer clothing, if it's still in good shape, is great. And we don't have a national policy on this, but I know some districts and some projects have a policy that they require volunteers to turn their clothing back in. And that's a good practice because we just don't want volunteers wearing clothing out in the public for no reason. But you know, some things like hats that get really sweaty and gross, you don't want to reuse those for someone else. But if they're in good condition and can be reused again, it's a great idea to have those for volunteers that come on, especially that come on when the system isn't open for ordering. Any other questions, comments, lessons learned? All right. Well, I thank everyone for your time and participation and sharing examples from your project. It always helps everyone to hear how things are being done across the Corps. So appreciate your participation. And we'll go ahead and close out for today. And maybe I'll see some of you next week on our final presentation.